When we associate longevity and fasting, it's easy to default to prolonged fasting, longer fasts being best for longevity because it's a more extreme caloric restriction. But we do need to look at a lot of nuance here. And there was a paper that was published in the journal Helion, which is quite interesting, and it really breaks things down into a little bit more granular detail. So let's go ahead and understand which is truly better for longevity, periodic intermittent fasting or longer prolonged fast, and when. After today's video, there is a free 1-month trial of Creatine gummies, and they revamped their formula as well. So now each gummy has 1.5 grams of creatine and less than a gram of added sugar. And at first you're like, wait a minute, why is there added sugar? Well, creatine uptakes better with a little bit of glucose to begin with. So that's the reason here. The gummies are predominantly sweetened with allulose as their primary sweetener. So 1.5 grams of creatine per gummy. It allows you to microdose your creatine throughout the day. There is some evidence that suggests that if you space out when you take creatine throughout the day, there's less water retention that comes with it. But the bottom line is that no matter who you are, whether you're an athlete that wants some more performance, maybe you want some better sleep, or you're someone that's just looking for a cognitive benefit, creatine has its place. And I had some pretty esteemed professionals in the creatine research world come in and vouch for that in a number of videos. So I'm a big creatine fan. I personally take about 3 to 5 grams per day, and these little gummies make it quick and easy. So that link is down below for a free 1-month trial of Create gummies. So before we get into the details of this study that did specifically look at intermittent fasting versus prolonged fasting, we need to understand one of the key reasons why we would fast for longevity. Nutrient deprivation, caloric restriction. It is something that has been pretty solid when it comes down to the correlation with longevity, living longer. However, we do need to understand how everything works. It has to do with something called FOXO3. There was actually a study published in the journal Aging Cell, and this study, first off, looked at mice, and they found that when mice would calorically restrict, when they would nutritionally deprive these mice, they would live longer. But what was interesting is when they eliminated this special thing called FOXO3, which is what's called the transcription factor, and I'll explain that in a minute. When they eliminated that, they knocked it out, they could restrict calories all they wanted to, and it didn't improve longevity. So clearly, FOXO3 is very, very important. FOXO3 is called a transcription factor. What it does is it travels to the nucleus of a cell, and when it travels to the nucleus of a cell, it makes it so that then you can express these various genes. Okay, so it travels to the nucleus and then triggers genes. In the case of FOXO3, the stress of fasting, the stress of caloric restriction triggers FOXO3 to express genes that increase glutathione, increase superoxide dismutase, and other internal antioxidants, which in turn make you stronger. So that's why what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, because when you put yourself in a stressful situation, e.g. fasting, you allow for upregulation of these things. To an extent, right? You can go too far. Just like you can sit in an ice bath for 15 minutes, completely freeze, go hypothermic and die, you can probably fast too much and cause so much stress, right? So this study that was published in Helion was interesting. What they ultimately found is they did this with white rabbits, which a little bit better model than rodents. And they had subjects either intermittent fast, where they would fast daily, but they would still eat during the day. It was just in a confined block, and the rate of caloric restriction was not as intense. They, of course, had a control group that ate regularly, and then they had a prolonged fasting group. Okay. Well, the intermittent fasting group had 2.5x higher FOXO3 than the prolonged fasting group. Well, wouldn't you think that prolonged fasting would create more FOXO3? Like, wouldn't it be a bigger stressor? Like, the more you calorically restrict, wouldn't you create more FOXO3? Didn't seem to be the case. The intermittent fasting group did better than the control group, because what happens is insulin is a blocker of FOXO3. So the group that was just eating continually, insulin was inhibiting FOXO3, so they were not getting that FOXO3 activation. The intermittent fasting group was getting a little bit of insulin when they would eat, and that would increase or decrease FOXO3. Okay? The prolonged fasting group didn't have any insulin because they weren't eating, right? But somehow FOXO3 was lower. Well, what's the deal here? Well, if you look further in the details, is IGF was significantly lower in the prolonged fasting group. That's insulin-like growth factor. So insulin-like growth factor requires insulin to really function, right? It's a growth factor that's associated with insulin and growth hormone, and it's actually pretty complicated axis when you really look at it. But in essence, you need to have some IGF for FOXO3 to actually function as well. So what good is the stress response if you never actually have fodder or fertilizer growth to ever make it really come to fruition? So what happened is the fasting group had so little IGF that they did not get the growth that's required to support the antioxidant production. Like they basically, and this is all theoretical, but based upon what we see in the actual data with this. So it's about finding that sweet spot. Prolonged fasting is epic when it comes down to metabolic health. Don't get me wrong. Okay? If you are overweight and you are hyperinsulinemic, then you are definitely impeding the actions or the activation of FOXO3. So step one, get the weight off. And if prolonged fasting is how you get the weight off and improve your hyperinsulinemia, that's going to be a bigger lever than you can pull. However, when you are really trying to say, I'm already a healthy person and I'm fasting for longevity, you may not want to do a lot of multi-day fasting. You may want to find that sweet spot of doing maybe 18, 20-hour, 22-hour fasts a few days per week where you get the stress response, you get the FOXO3 activation, you get the subsequent antioxidant increase, and you get the insulin and the pro-growth that you need to sustain mass, hormones, antioxidant, enzymatic function, and also simple NAD activity that allows for sirtuins to activate FOXO3 via different pathways. What I mean in a very simple sense is too much fasting doesn't just waste you away. Too much fasting negates its own benefit. So you do want to find that sweet spot. But step one, get the weight off. And I don't care if you use prolonged fasting to get there. But once your levels are in check, it's all the more reason to periodically fast versus prolonged fast. As always, keep it locked in here on my channel. I'll see you tomorrow.